In my introduction video, I mentioned how this channel is for stamps that I think are cool. And honestly, I think that gives me a lot of options because I think a lot of stamp designs are great, even looking backwards. But are there any that are truly ugly? There were the limits of single color printing, and there are some that are dated but look kind of cool in their own way. There are a few designs that were literally drawn by children, so it's not really fair to pick on them. There is one stamp that put function over form so purely that it's hard to find any redeeming aesthetic value in it, and it's this one. You can see that the design is just text, and it reads, "This US stamp, along with 25 cents of additional US postage, is equivalent to the F stamp rate." Out of the context of when it was used, it might not even be clear what that means. This is an example of non-denominated postage, which is actually the norm today, but was only used sporadically in the past. In this video, we'll look at what that means and how this ugly stamp came to be. Here's a question. How much does it cost to mail a letter today, just with a standard first-class stamp? Okay, you might know as somebody who's watching a video about stamps on YouTube, but I would guess that the average American can't give you the exact answer. A big reason for that is that prices, or denominations, mostly don't appear on stamps anymore. We have non-denominated postage. Not only that, but we have forever stamps now, which are able to send a letter even if stamp prices change after buying them. If you're young enough, you might not remember that that wasn't always the case. The first forever stamp was issued in 2007, and by 2011, all first-class letter stamps were forever. Before that, though, we had denominated postage, where the price of the stamp was on the stamp, and it was fixed at the price you bought it at. If the price to send a letter changed, your old stamp wouldn't be enough anymore, and you'd need to buy another stamp to make up the difference. Knowing the price to send a letter actually mattered. Like I said though, non-denominated postage did occasionally get some use prior to the forever stamps, and generally speaking, these came about because of the collision between two slow processes that depended on each other. The first was getting a new stamp designed, printed, and distributed across the country for purchase. Now, going through the entire process of suggesting and choosing a topic and picking an artist and selecting a final design can take years. But assuming a design is chosen and just the rate printed on it needs changing, those last steps can still take months. If a rate change is announced, the Postal Service can't really be nimble about getting new stamps out there. The second slow process involved was good old government bureaucracy. From 1970 to 2006, stamp prices were determined by the Postal Rate Commission, which was created after Congress dismantled the U.S. Post Office Department. Fun fact, the old Post Office Department was cabinet level, which meant that the Postmaster General was part of the presidential line of succession. There were periods of U.S. history where the office was sixth in line to be president. Anyway, raising postal rates with the new commission involved a lot of red tape of public hearings and studies and meetings, so even if the Postal Service suspected that a rate hike was coming, they might not know exactly when it would kick in or exactly how big it would be. 1 cent? 2 cents? 3 cents? They couldn't start printing in advance without the risk of being wrong and having a bunch of useless stamps on their hands. Cut to 1975. The Postal Service was coming up to the deadline of when they would need to start printing their Christmas stamps, which usually came out around October. Actually, here are 2022's Holiday Elves stamps. I think they're really cute. The Postal Service prints a lot of Christmas stamps. In 1975, they ended up printing 1.5 billion of them. But they were in a situation like I just described. They knew a postal increase was coming, but they didn't know if it would happen before or after the big Christmas mail rush. So instead of guessing, they decided to issue the first non-denominated stamps in Postal Service history. Instead of having a price, they had the year printed on them, and whatever rate would be in effect during the holiday season is what they would be worth. That turned out to be 10 cents. The change to 13 cents didn't end up taking effect until the new year. But these are different than forever stamps. This stamp today is still only worth 10 cents. We get more examples of non-denominated Christmas stamps, once in 1981 and again in 1991, when rate changes were close to the holiday season. But that initial experience gave the Postal Service an idea. They could use non-denominated postage for the next rate change, even if it didn't happen around Christmas. Not only that, they could print a bunch of it in advance and just have it on hand and ready when it would be needed. So that's what they did. To distinguish between non-denominated postage from different rate changes, they decided to use a letter system. They started at the beginning, A-rate postage, which ended up being used in 1978. We had 2 rate increases in 1981, which called on the B and C stamps, and next came the D stamp. You can see the advanced printing on the D stamps. Even though they were used in 1985, they had a copyright printed of 1981. So I'm not sure I would call these ugly, but they definitely didn't put a lot of work into making these look interesting. In 1988, they did get a little bit more creative, although in a children's educational book sort of way. E was for Earth, and in 1991, F was for flower. I'm not sure if this image is astronomically correct, but it is a step up from the first 4 letters. In 1994, we got the G stamp, which of course stands for Old Glory, and in 1998, we got H for hat. So again, the letter stamps were put into place because they weren't sure what the new postal rate would be. But there's another side to this. The people with old stamps printed under the old rate. If they wanted to use those without wasting money, they would need a makeup stamp that was equal to the number of cents that the postal rate increased. But again, they didn't know what that rate would be. For some of the early rate changes, they had shortages of the 2 or 3 cent stamps at first until printing could catch up. But for the F rate stamp, they decided to be prepared by having another non-denominated stamp. And that stamp was the one I showed in the introduction. Hopefully you understand the text now. The rate change for the F stamp was from 25 cents to 29 cents, so this stamp ended up being worth 4 cents. But why this? What was the designer thinking? Luckily, those questions aren't rhetorical. The U.S. Stamp Yearbook that Linz put out for 1991 has an extended discussion from Richard Sheaf, the designer of the stamp, about the process behind this being approved. And honestly, it sounds like the case of a creative person with good ideas running into a brick wall of design by committee and ultimately having to give up on everything they wanted. The initial idea that Sheaf and the director of stamp marketing at the Postal Service came up with was to call this new type of non-denominated postage the plus stamp, and to have an ad campaign informing the public of how it worked. The yearbook has a number of proposed ideas that Sheaf came up with, some with almost no text, others with more, but all featuring the plus sign as the major design element. After a year or so of drafts, though, the Citizen Stamp Advisory Committee couldn't agree on a design with a plus sign, and requested that Sheaf instead try an ampersand and eventually some other random designs. An additional problem was what the exact wording should be. They ended up not wanting to rely on a public education campaign, which made the required text longer and longer, to the point where there wasn't room for an image at all anymore. As a final insult, Sheaf said he chose the font used because he specifically liked how it looked in all caps, but eventually the text was so long that it had to be typeset in both upper and lowercase letters. To the credit of the committee, the G and H rate makeup stamps did look a lot better, and they reduced the amount of text a lot. There were 4 more rate changes between 2000 and 2007, the year the Postal Service introduced forever stamps, but they abandoned the letter system for them and instead just labeled them first class. Which is a shame. Having an I letter stamp would have opened a lot of possibilities for writing messages with them. With A through G, you can go to the cafe and order a decaf and maybe some cabbage. So that's the story of one of the ugliest stamps the Postal Service has ever put out. Linz Stamp News, which is a weekly publication about stamps, actually runs an annual poll where one of the categories is the year's worst stamp designs. So you think that'd be a good place to look for more ugliness. Last year's loser was the Message Monsters set, and the third worst rated was the Day of the Dead set, both of which I've shown in previous videos because I like them. So like I said at the beginning of this video, this channel is for stamps that I think are cool, but just know that the stamp collecting community disagrees with my tastes. Thanks for watching. If you don't disagree with my taste in stamp designs, check out some of my other videos. 2 years ago, the winner of the Linz poll was the Mayflower in Plymouth Harbor, and the set that got both worst design and least necessary was the hip hop set. So maybe the stamp collecting community is just all big nerds.